we are discussing work motivation and its implication for the management studies. In the couple of other lectures, we have talked about different theories of motivation, and we have also discussed Herzberg's theory of work motivation, where the concept of job enrichment was discussed. And you can see that the implications of Herzberg's theory, if we see from the management point of view, as suggested by Miner, we find that we have direct feedback, client relationships, new learning, scheduling, unique expertise, control over resources, direct communications, and personal accountability. So, all these factors we have to consider for work motivation as part of job enrichment strategy. This brings us to another theory which we call as the job characteristics theory, which is proposed by Heckman and Oldham, and what they have suggested that every job has some core job characteristics which lead to critical psychological states, and of course, then they result into the motivation process, that combination. In terms of job characteristics, they have emphasized that skill variety, task identity, and feedback are some of the important factors. Do I repeat? Skill, variety, task, identity, and feedback are the factors. I am talking about the core characteristics of a job. You can see that the idea comes from job enrichment in this job characteristics theory, and these characteristics lead to critical psychological states, and finally, this will lead to the outcome, that is the work motivation. And so, if you really want that people should be motivated, there should be high motivating potential. There should be high motivating potential in any job. And as they have put it, in fact, they have put that as a real formulation, that what they are saying, that task identity, task variety, and other task characteristics are added, and the average of that is multiplied by feedback. That means, feedback has a multiplicative property. For any motivating situation, we need to give feedback. So, the same model, they have tried to translate that into a kind of a formula which we call as the motivating potential score of a job. Motivating potential score of a job, okay, because that all depends on your perception. How do you perceive the job, the identity and variety, and so on. Therefore, that has implication for management in terms of the application of work motivation strategies. Now, next what we are discussing is the performance based reward system. Do I take you back to what we did last time. Yeah, Herzberg's theory we have done, work redesign we have done. Okay. This discussion we have already had. Okay. So, the performance reward used to elicit desirable response from employees must be perceived as equitable. You would recollect that we had discussed about a theory called equity theory of work motivation, and in equity theory of work motivation we were trying to understand that how people evaluate their work motivation in terms of their input, outcome and the comparison with the other person in the total scenario. Do you recollect that? We had discussed the equity theory sometimes earlier. So, when we are talking about the performance based reward system, equity plays an important role in that situation. But in addition to equity, you also have expectation. So, in fact, Vroom, one of the researchers, he has talked about expectation in this performance and reward relationship. If you expect something in a situation, perhaps that becomes a great motivator, and the whole process is analyzed through the kind of expectation that you have. So, reward expectation relationship, that also becomes extremely important in this situation. As we have discussed earlier, commitment, which is very much related to the whole process of the psychological state, is also important, and which refers to loyalty of a person for the work or for organization. So, we can have work commitment or we can have organizational commitment, and if a person is highly committed, the person will not leave the organization, will be committed to the job, and in fact, that is I should say a good strategy or good business when you are able to retain good employees at the place of work. So, the underlying factor again there is the implication of motivation, okay, work motivation. If a person is not motivated intrinsically, he or she is likely to leave your organization. Therefore, commitment becomes an important factor when we are talking about even the performance based analysis of job of the reward system. Sorry. Now, in addition to this, there are number of other factors like absenteeism. Absenteeism, all of you understand, when a person takes leave or remains away from the job, okay, which is the leave that is not sanctioned to him. Okay. So, that may be, you can say, not really the legal sanction is given to the person that you can remain absent, but suddenly you find a person remains absent. There could be a pattern, but there could be an erratic behavior, but the matter of fact is that the person is not coming regularly for work, and what are the reasons? Away from some other reasons like sickness, we have motivational issues involved in this. People are not interested in work for various reasons, and absenteeism becomes an important challenge for many of the management practitioners. See, you have an industry, suppose assembly line, absenteeism becomes an important issue. Even in other situations also, if a person who has got to perform a particular job suddenly does not turn up for the job, you can see how the manager is going to manage that situation at the last moment. So, absenteeism becomes again a very difficult a situation for the managers, as it is the attrition rate of people. Now, if people are highly committed, then they have intrinsic motivation. So, there is an intrinsic reward that is coming, and one of the major implications of that is that people will be loyal and they will try to remain in your organization for a much longer time than perhaps others. But if you find that people are not motivated, they do not find the work as a very challenging work, not very interesting. I am talking about things away from money. See, money is important, which is an extrinsic factor, but in addition to this, number of other work motivation factors are there, which are very important for the organization. We are not denying that we do not have to give money, because if we go back to the interpretation of the theories that we have done earlier, we find that money is important for survival. Money is important to some extent, for motivating for a higher level need. This interpretation we have done already in some of the earlier theoretical propositions. So, we are not really debating that do not give any money and then ask them to work. We are saying reasonable amount of money is required, but if we believe that okay, money is the only motivator, perhaps we are not very right in our decision. So, what here we are trying to understand is that work motivation has implications for strategies, demotivating situations, and some of them might result into lack of commitment, absenteeism, and also turnover. You understand the meaning of turnover. Here we are meaning employees turnover at the place of work. Okay. Is it clear? We are not talking about the financial implications here, we are talking about employees turnover. That means the employees, how many employees in your organization are continuing, or they come and perhaps they do not remain in your organization. Okay. So, that is again a motivational strategy. And turnover becomes an important factor for any manager to see that there is a very good work environment, work motivation climate in the organization. In fact, all these lead to something like what we call as the psychological contract. All these lead to something what we call as psychological contract. Some of you might be wondering what this contract would be. This is an unwritten set of expectations, unwritten set of contract. It is not written anywhere, but moment we enter in any organization, we have certain expectations and we would like to abide by those. So, the contract is from both sides, okay. Employees contract with the management, and management's of course contract, okay, with the employees. The idea here is that this is an expectation and unwritten, but breaks there may be. That is why the work climate should be such and the job design should be such, the reward strategy should be such that the contract is not broken. Okay. Reward, when we are talking about both intrinsic reward and the extrinsic factors. Okay. So, we have to create a work environment where people feel motivated, they come forward with creative ideas, they contribute to the functioning of the organization, they are satisfied themselves and they continue in the organization for a much longer time than then normally people perhaps we are not talking about that necessarily they have to be there for all their life, but yes, reasonably very long time. And this is a challenging task for any management practitioner, that they have motivated people and result is good performance. And in fact, that is also a good strategy, that if you can retain your employees for a longer time, you do not need to retrain them, you do not need to invest even any kind of a budget in that. Okay. So, you can see that we can translate the work motivation strategy into a long term planning strategy for an organization. So, we have discussed now the work motivation theories and its implications for work motivation at the place of work. And very closely tied to this concept is the issue of communication. Okay. Now, we will just come to the communication process in a short while. Let us see the performance based reward system. How do we implement that? Now, when we are talking about performance based reward system, we have to first step to operationalize the positive reinforcement approach. Positive reinforcement approach, and then specific desirable behavior such as coming on time, regular attendance, production norms. Just a few examples. Now, in this reinforcement schedule is worked out in such a way that as and when such behavior occurs, the employee is rewarded and then the behavior is reinforced. Here, what we are talking about is the keyword reinforcement. We are trying to talk about reinforcement, that means can you reinforce a behavior, okay? And this reinforcement is a strategy that we are using, and here we are trying to say that reinforcement schedule should be very consciously, you have to give positive reinforcement. Now, positive reinforcement, if we say, how does that come? What do you do when you want to give positive reinforcement? Is it only the money that you are offering as positive reinforcement? Well, money could be one of the factors, but positive reinforcement will also relate to, say, pat at the back. The manager appreciates you and you feel motivated. So, when we are talking about positive reinforcement, it could be in very tangible terms like giving a reward or giving some money or some bonus, very tangible one, or it could be in terms of pat at the back, the smile, or any other positive behavioral we can say indication that is also equally reinforcing. So, we can either have the policies that we make in terms of the allocation system, or we can also have some of these strategies like reinforcing behavior. So, if a manager is really practicing work motivation strategies, then reinforcement is the principle that manager has to really practice, because if you want a behavior to continue, that means you have to give some reinforcement. Okay. It may be a simple smile of the manager, which is very, very encouraging. So, reinforcement schedule here, this has to be worked out very consciously. Sometimes if it is it relates to the extrinsic reward, we can work out the reinforcement schedule. Okay. But the other examples which I gave you, these come automatically to perhaps a successful manager, who automatically knows that when to smile and when to give a pat at the back. Okay. You do not have to really do any kind of scheduling for that, but scheduling is necessary when we have an extrinsic kind of a reward, and very consciously we try to say that okay, for this one we are going to give this reward. But in addition to this, the managerial style might become a reward for you. Okay, you have done very well, pat at the back, they smile. Okay, we can repeat, and you can now imagine yourself as a manager, okay, a good excellent manager, where you have developed these styles for yourself. Okay. So, what we are trying to talk about is performance based rewards, okay, could be tangible or intangible. Okay. Now, very closely tied. Okay, let me just close I'll just come back to the communication in a short while from now. Now, when we are talking about this performance based reward, an important factor there, when I said that manager gives a pat at the back or manager smiles, these are communication strategies. Okay. So, a good manager perhaps can be an excellent communicator as well. And so, very closely tied to the process of work motivation is the communication process that we have to understand. Whatever we have discussed about work motivation theories, there is a lot written on that, lot of studies have been conducted. Only we are talking only about a handful of those, and if we will see the other implications perhaps will emerge, because we have seen earlier that motivation is a very complex issue that talks about the organization and the work climate, that talks about the work characteristics, and that also talks about the individual characteristics. So, sometimes the same motivational strategy may not work for all the employees. However good the man, he may be very good communicator, he may be very good person encouraging people, yet it depends much depends on the characteristic of the employees as well. Okay. So, you can see the complexity of this whole process, yet good managers are good managers, and they have really mastered the skill of motivating their employees. One important consideration in that is the process of communication. So, now we take up what is the meaning of communication, how can we communicate in a very successful fashion. So, first let us understand the process of communication, with special reference of course to organizations, but communication relates to other spheres of our lives as well. So, now I talk to you about the communication process. The communication process, I am sure you understand communication. When I am talking to you, that is a communication. When you are talking to me, that is a communication. That means, for communication, at least two of us are required. Okay. Also, that is a social situation in which two persons are required. One person sends a message and the other person receives a message. In fact, it is quite like the electronic communication that you have. Okay. From say the TV station, you want to send a message, and the TV set receives the message. So, the two sender and receiver. Okay. So, here we have tried to present a model of human communication or social communication, which is presented most of the standard books, that the person has an idea. Okay. You have an idea and you want to give that idea to me. Okay. Normally, it looks very simple to you, but actually you can see that it goes through so many stages, though the whole process is so quick that you never realized that you have an idea that you want to send to the person. The idea then gets translated into words that we call as encoding. In your other machine communication, again, you may have some kind of encoding. Then there is a transmission. This is over to channel also in your machine communication, but here we are talking about over to channel. That means, how do we communicate? Are we communicating by speech, by speaking, by, can you communicate with your eyes? Can you? I am sure you have. Okay. Can you communicate with a smile? I am sure you do. Okay. So, when we say what channel of communication we are using, the normal channel of communication of course is speaking, but in addition to this there are many non-verbal channels of communication. We will just come to that in short while from now. Now, so the receiver, the other person, you are trying to say something to me, I am trying to receive that. Okay. So, I am the other person, I must be tuned to your channel, is not it? If I do not understand your language, then how do I, you may be saying something great, but I am not able to understand that, because I am not tuned to that channel. Okay. And then once I have taken your idea, I have understood it, then I will decode that idea into my understanding. Okay. So, you had some idea, we had that communication, I have received that idea, and then based on that then I act. Okay. So, I act upon that, I react, I ignore, I accept, or whatever I want. Okay. Why are we discussing this model human communication? Is that as a manager we have to be very sort of aware of and trained perhaps for good communication. Okay. So, that means you need to be aware of what to say, how to say, and what language to say. If the same course I am teaching to someone who does not understand my language, then perhaps I have to translate that into some other language. Only then my communication gets across. Otherwise, what will happen? Communication will break. Okay. So, as a manager, if you are trying to communicate, whether you are giving an official order, whether you are trying to take a feedback, whether it is an official communication or semi-official communication or even personal communication, whatever be the need for requirement for communication at that point of time, you have to see that the channel is open, okay, that the person is able to understand. Okay. And in this channel, can there be any barrier? In this whole model, can there be any barrier? You talk about noise in your other types of machine communication. There are barriers in human communications and social communications. Okay. And the barriers when see that when I say, just let me see whether I am going to talk to you about barrier, right. So, the barriers, now where will the barriers come in that communication process? In that, why did we discuss that model? The reason is that unless you have some kind of a flow diagram, you will not be able to actually understand that where the barriers actually will be seen. Now, the barriers in communication could be mainly at three levels, not to say that this is the whole explanation, but generally researchers have tried to say that it could be a physical barrier, it could be a semantic barrier, or it could be psychosocial or personal barrier. As we can see, the physical barrier, distance, noise, interference. Have you ever experienced a physical barrier in communication? Well, if you want to sometimes call someone from a long distance, okay, and you may try to raise your voice, but the person is not able to hear. Physical barrier, with all good intention, with everything you understand, and you are trying to call a person, the person is not able to hear. So, there is a barrier, communication does not get across. But the interesting examples could also be that when we are teaching here, and every moment we find the planes going through over our building, okay, many a times to stop for a moment. Why? Because of that so much of the plane noise, sometimes you will find that perhaps you can't hear me, and so I will stop for a fraction of a second, let the plane sort of go. Okay. These are some of the examples of physical barrier. Okay. So, we have to take care that any kind of a, so here we really mean the noise in that physical sense, okay, physical barrier when we are talking about. Now, the semantic barriers, this is the limitation of the symbolic system. We can say the limitation in terms of language. The person, and a short while ago I was talking to you about that, limitation in terms of language. That is very important, because person may be very good, very well trained, but the language is sometimes the problem, the limitation for communication. In fact, as the globalization is coming, just to talk to you about the need of language. See, bilingual or multilingual managers are in great demand. The reason is that we are going in for the international business now. There is globalization, and so the managers, if they understand more than one language, they are big assets for the organization, because we can to a great extent manage this semantic barrier kind of a thing. Okay, you get my point. So, the bilingual manager, and that is why you find that even language becomes an important factor for our the training of managers. Okay. So, the semantic barriers, well, that does include not only the language, but also sometimes some connotations that you might use for your language, the sometimes some special style that you might use for the language, because that is special to a particular kind of a training, or the person has not been exposed to that. Okay. So, when we are talking about semantic barriers, we are using all these examples. So, the basic idea is the limitation of the symbolic symptom. It may also be applied to the non-verbal communication. We will just discuss communication now. And the third kind of a barrier which comes in our human and social communication or communication at the place of work is the barrier because of emotions, barrier because of the values and judgments. You have certain value about certain concept, and even if someone else is trying to say that this is what is very good, you may not accept that communication in the same way as perhaps the other person, because of the value that you attribute to that particular issue or particular phenomenon or thing or whatever. Okay. So, or you are emotionally attached or detached to a particular thing. Okay. I may try to convince you a lot, but because you have a mindset based on your emotional makeup in terms of that particular issue, it may be very difficult for me to get across that idea to you. You may start accepting that idea after a number of years, when you have perhaps experienced that. But today, when someone is trying idea, okay, you may ignore it or you may not accept it, and so that is a barrier. Okay. So, the intention of the person who is trying to give you some communication or who is trying to send a message is very perhaps well designed and positive, yet communication may not get across because of number of reasons, and these are the barriers in human and social communications. Okay. So, as a manager, this generally applies also to our lives, but as a manager at the place of work, you have to see that there are no barriers in your communication. Okay. So, a good manager will try to see that how best I can communicate. Well, we can give training in communication skills also, but also much depends on your desire to really communicate. Okay. So, the desire also has to come from both sides to communicate and to accept communication and try to see that there are no barriers whatsoever. Okay. Isn't that interesting? We have perhaps all of you know about communication, every day we communicate, but you never paid any attention to this aspect of human communication. So, with becoming very conscious, you can become a very good communicator, and in turn of course, a very good person in terms of the knowledge of management. So, I will take you back to okay, let me talk to you about the levels of communications now. So, having discussed the process of communication, that flow diagram that we have discussed, and seen that at various levels we may have barriers, we should also try to understand that the communication should be at the verbal level and at the non-verbal level. Short while ago I was also talking to you about that. verbal and non-verbal of communication. Okay. Verbal, okay, when we are talking about verbal level communication, will written communication be verbal or non-verbal communication? What do you understand? Okay, that is considered as a verbal communication. Even written communication comes under verbal communication. Okay. But non-verbal communication, when we say, that is about, as I said, gestures, postures, your eye communicating through eyes, okay, any kind of a body language, your smile, even you are walking, sometimes excited, you come running, okay, the person understands, okay, the person is really excited coming running, or you come to meet the person with a big smile, or you may come with a very dry face, we do not know. Okay. So, communication could be non-verbal, and in fact, that communication is more effective in the sense that when we are talking, only verbal communication perhaps does not make the communication perfect. You need to, but for say in the written communication, there are no face expressions, okay, even though emotions may still be there. But when we are talking face to face communication, in that you will find that non-verbal communication plays a very, very important role, non-verbal communication. Okay. Otherwise, what will happen, that the person will start talking like no pitch, no sound, okay, in a some kind of a monologue kind of a thing. I am teaching communication to you, something like that. Okay. I am sure you will not like anyone speaking with some kind of a communication that does not have any pitch, any sound, any kind of a, excitement, or any kind of a involvement when you are talking about. Okay. So, non-verbal communication includes body language as well. Okay. And sometimes people agree, disagree, they do not talk, they just speak to each other with eyes, okay, and the thing is done. So, non-verbal communication is a great communicator, and that actually makes your verbal communication very, very effective. Okay. Therefore, if you say that non-verbal communication is not important, that is not true. And you are all doing that, and now you can go back and think about it, that what non-verbal communication cues you are using yourself. Much of that may be your socialization, it may be your culture, because from childhood whatever you have seen, okay, you have developed some kind of a non-verbal communication, we can say the cues or the styles. Okay. And that is how in communication we all differ. Something very formally we learn, okay, and something we have learned from our socialization process. Okay. And how best you can make use of communication, something we can train, how to make a pronunciation, how to have some kind of a pause, how to I mean we can also give some training to polish that. Okay. But whatever is the case, manager is a successful manager when he has also mastered the skill of communication, and that has great motivating again I should say potential for the employees in an organization. Now, in addition to verbal and non-verbal communication, as we have talked about here, we have formal and informal communication. Okay. Formal communications are, say, the company orders, company reports, and all kinds of the formal reports that we have. Okay. And the informal communication is the one that you have, even as a social group. So, even though the character of formal and informal communications are different, but sometimes they also come very close to each other, but formal communication often in the written form, in form of order and things like that. So is it that the communication becomes very important for us as a motivating factor as well. Okay. It leads to motivation, it leads to great job satisfaction. Okay, if your manager is not a very good communicator, sometimes he may be very good, technically, but like you may not enjoy things, that much. If you have a technically high caliber manager and a good communicator plus good communicator, you will find that you enjoy many-fold. Okay. So it is not a bad idea to develop a good communication skill to motivate yourself as well as whenever you are at the place of work. Now, the levels of communications. See, when we are talking about communication in an organization, then many types of communication networks emerge, communication networks. And what we are talking about now is how this communication is organized, who talks to whom, that kind of a communication network. Okay. One communication network is that there is a leader and there are different persons. Okay. Only leader communicates to different persons. Okay. So, this communication is coming only from one leader to the other. Okay. Then you may have a Y-shaped communication, okay, that the leader is talking to other persons, okay, and leader is also talking to the management. You can have a chain kind of a middle person, then the person who is actually working, and you can have a leader. Okay. But the most important communication network, as we understand, those are the very situations that we have talked about. We have to understand all channel communication. And in all channel communication, see the overall communication strategy we are talking about for the place of work. Okay. So, the leader is there, he is talking to the other person, and you can see that even though leader is there upwards, yet the channel of communication, each person is also communicating to the other person. That is interesting here, and that is a distinction from the other three simple models that we have talked about. Typically, in most of the organizations, you will find that there is a leader, there is a middle person, there are employees, 3 levels of hierarchy. Okay. And the order is given by the leader to the middle foreman to the lower level employee. But in all channel communication, you can see the beauty of all channel communication is that each employee has freedom to communicate with the other employee, okay. Freedom in terms of organizational culture. Okay. Otherwise, if the organization is very autocratic type, then that freedom may not be there, because then organization will always be sort of monitoring that particular thing. But if it is a organic, democratic, participative type, then you will find that all channel communication comes in which all channels of communication are open. Okay, people have great satisfaction, they can talk to each other. Okay, and everyone can talk to the manager, manager can of course speak to everyone, that of course happens everywhere, but others have much greater satisfaction in all channel communication. Okay. Also, the actually here the motivating potential is coming from creating an HRD climate, HR climate, where you create such a work culture, people can communicate with each other. Okay. So all channel communication is recommended, and as the practice of management, we should try to see that the all channel communication climate is created. Now, the issue comes why communication is important. Why is it important? Because it actually affects all those management functions which we had discussed in the beginning of the course, that the management has certain important functions: planning, organizing, staffing, directing, controlling. I am sure you recollect that we were talking about it in the earlier course, earlier lectures, okay, the beginning of the course in fact. So, you can see that communication is so important process that it is important for all these management functions. Okay. In fact, some of the authors have said that communication is actually the bottleneck in all these processes, in planning, organizing, staffing, directing, controlling. Okay. For all these processes, the communication actually is the most important person, and because of this there may be bottleneck. Okay. So, what we find that communication becomes very important, whether it is formal or informal. Communication we are talking about. Okay. This so we have already discussed the barriers to communication. Okay. And this brings us to our understanding of that motivation is very important. Motive is important, okay, and situations are important, people are important, okay, and interplay of cultural, organizational and other factors are important. Okay. So, combining this, now we are going to discuss about the organizational management in terms of the other processes that we call as the roles that we play. We will be also talking about the how groups behave in organizations, because from communication we move on to the group behavior, the kind of roles that we play in organizations, and of course, the leadership style. Can we develop some kind of a leadership style? Do we need to develop some kind of a leadership style? So, in the next lecture, we are going to discuss some of these issues.